Hello there, and thanks for tuning in. My name is John Hathaway, and today we're going to be discussing Disney's The Kid, and we're going to be talking about how this movie applies to certain psychological concepts such as the shadow, the ego, the authentic self, the future self, things like that, the true self, however you want to name it. There's several different words you could use or terms, but um, this movie has been one that I've been wanting to do a review of on this channel for a while, or maybe more of a discussion. I really like this movie. It's just a wonderful movie. It's good for, I mean, it's enjoyable for kids, but it's also got a lot of truth to it when it comes to like psychological things and how our minds work and things like that, and dealing with like trauma and like childhood trauma and different things. So I thought it would be valuable to discuss, since last year I kind of started getting into some of this stuff, like therapy and mental health and shadow work and different things like that. So I thought, ever since I watched this movie again last year, I've been really wanting to make a video discussing it, and then I just thought maybe now would be a good time to do it. So I watched it again. Actually just watched it this morning before going to work, and also kind of on my way to work, just and like listening to it on the phone and stuff like that. But but yeah, we're gonna talk about it. So, by the way, if you're new to this channel, if you enjoy, if you've watched any of the videos and you enjoy the content that I produce, I would appreciate if you would subscribe. Make sure you like this video, and also hit the bell notification so that you don't miss any future content. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into this episode. So before I talk about, before we start discussing this movie, The Kid, Disney's The Kid, I wanted to just kind of give you guys a refresher on the whole concept of like the shadow, Carl Jung's The Shadow, and shadow work and things like that. So Carl Jung he was a Swiss psychologist, and he's famous for coining the term the shadow, or the shadow self. And basically, when I've talked about shadow work and things like that before, that basically comes from that concept of the shadow that Carl Jung came up with. And if you're not familiar with what it means, it would be like say there's parts of you, and there's in all of us, we all have parts of us that have been kind of repressed in our childhood, or in our younger years, that either they've been like enculturated out of us because society or our families or our whatever the place, the environment that we grew up in, if those parts of ourselves were looked down upon or frowned upon, then we tend to repress those things so that we can be more accepted, because nobody wants to be hated. Everyone wants, well, for the most part, most people want you to like them. And so we start to compartmentalize different parts of ourselves, and we push certain parts down, and the part that we repress down, or that we hide, that we try to avoid, and we try to like basically make it where it's not a part of ourselves anymore, that would be considered the shadow. For me, as I've done shadow work and I've tried to learn about kind of how my shadow operates, I kind of see it whenever like I'm in socially stressful situations, like if I'm at work and if there's a lot of pressure put on me by either by like a manager or by coworkers or by customers or different things like that, and I'm like expected to do something within a certain time frame, and there's a lot of pressure put on me, well, then I start to I start to notice my anxiety going up a little bit, and there's other things too. I mean, like sometimes I might get a little bit emotional about certain things. Like and there's movies that my wife laughs at me because I don't outwardly show a lot of emotion, but there's certain movies like Inside Out would be one of them, where like when I've watched the first Inside Out movie, I think I teared up a little bit the first time I watched it, and I think even a couple of times after that I've teared up a little bit, just because it's it makes, something about it makes me emotional, and it just rings true in a lot of senses that makes my emotions, it just basically clicks with something and makes me a little bit emotional. Also, like when I was a child, I remember crying when I watched the movie Bambi, when Bambi's mother dies and things like that. So whenever like something makes me sad, I know that I can sometimes I can tend to tear up, get kind of teary-eyed, and I can weep a little bit or whatever. But crying is considered to be not a manly thing in our culture today, and in a lot of cultures around the world. It's kind of looked like, that's kind of seen as like a feminine trait or personality, or like a feminine quality, is when someone is emotional and they cry and things like that. So so it's something that I have repressed. I've learned that I've repressed that, and so I'm trying not to repress that as much these days. Basically, sometimes I find healthy ways to let my emotions, to express my emotions. Maybe when I'm not around a whole lot of people, it tends to be a little bit less stressful if I can do it when I'm alone. But sometimes it just comes out when it comes out, and I can't help myself. So and that's okay. And there's other things in my shadow. Like I noticed that I can get a little bit of a temper sometimes too, and I think, like, looking back to my childhood, I remember I had quite a temper on me when people would take my things, or play with one of my toys or something like that, or when they would make fun of me, I would get very defensive and angry. And so I notice sometimes that I can get angry, and I try to keep it controlled, but that's probably part of my shadow self as well. Now we're going to talk a little bit about, there's these other sides, like there's the ego, and then there's the authentic self. The shadow is the part of ourselves that we usually don't want to associate with. The ego would, and it's also sometimes called the false self. Basically, it's what we try to portray as our main personality, as it's what we want people to see in us. Basically, and a lot of times you hear the word ego and people just think, oh, well, that someone's just has a big ego, they're very prideful and things like that. And but in a psychological sense, the word ego is referring to the part of ourselves that we want people to know about, that we want people to think about us, and it's basically our false self. If you do some of this kind of meditation, inner work, and therapy, you can do, there's different kinds of things you can do, shadow work, you'll realize that the things that you associate as like that you identify with, that you identify as like a like you might say, I identify as a good Christian person, or I identify as an athlete, or I identify as just, I don't know, you could throw whatever you want out there, but you'll realize that that's not your true self. That's that's kind of a facade, or that's something that you've put out there as your that's what your false self wants you to be seen as. That's what your ego wants to be seen as, but that's not truly who you are. And the more that you do shadow work and that you learn about these other sides that you repress and you try to bring them out, you realize that there's actually some good stuff in the parts of yourself that were hidden for so many years and that were looked down upon. When you learn to integrate that shadow into your life, it can be more beneficial. You can learn to have a little bit more agency in life, be able to be more assertive, and go make bigger differences in yours and in other people's lives in a positive way. So yeah, there's the shadow self, and then the ego, and then there's the authentic self, which is basically when you learn to integrate your shadow with your main personality, and you kind of let go of that ego, or you don't become so attached to the identity of the ego, and you let the shadow kind of merge in with your personality, then you start to become your more authentic self, or your true self. And that's kind of the focus of shadow work, is for you to discover your authentic self, become more authentic, become your true self. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into the topic of this movie, The Kid by Disney. So, The Kid stars Bruce Willis. This movie came out in the year 2000. I've watched it 3 or 4 times, I think. Like I said earlier, I just watched it again this morning for a refresher before I did this video. And this movie is just such a good portrayal. I think it does the best job of any movie that I can think of to describe kind of these concepts of the shadow and ego and the true self and shadow work and things like that. So basically, the premise of this movie is that Bruce Willis's character, his name is Russ. He is this, he's called an image consultant. He has these wealthy clients, like news reporters, news anchors, maybe different spokesmen for different companies, for different big companies. Some may have like celebrities and stuff that work for him. I mean, not that work for him, that he helps, that he works for them, and what this image consultant does is he like helps them with their public image too. And I wish that I had the notes with me. I took some notes this morning at home on this, but there was a quote but I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm not going to go there right now. A really good quote in the movie, though, that talks about what he does. But anyway, so he's an image consultant, which I think is that was a very genius choice for them to choose that, because in this movie, Bruce Willis's character, the main character throughout the movie, you could kind of represent it as the ego, or the false self. He is very successful by the world's standards, very wealthy, has a good career. He's assertive, he's aggressive, he like knows what he wants and things like that. But at the same time, there's a lot of things that he's missing. Like he's not married, he doesn't have any kids, he's almost 40 years old, and he doesn't really have a significant other. He doesn't have a good relationship with his father. He there's just like he's just always has like these anger issues, or he's has kind of a short temper with people, and he's just very egoic. If you've heard the term, it basically has to do with that psychological term, the ego. Means you're very wrapped up in your ego. So he's very egoic, and basically one day, as he's coming home from work, he sees that the gate to his house or mansion or whatever, it's been opened or something like that. Someone got in, or he thinks someone tried to break into his house or something. So he calls this lady that's like his assistant, his secretary, and tells her to call the security system, the company that does the security system for his house, and to make sure that they're watching everything and making sure that everything's safe. Well, anyway, that night he wakes up at like 3 a.m. and he notices that he sees this kid. Well, I think he finds this toy airplane, and it says Rusty on it, like it has written the name Rusty. And he kind of recognizes it as a toy that he had when he was a kid, but he didn't see it for a long time. And then when he walks out further and he sees this kid, and he runs away, leaves the house and stuff like that. So later, he goes to a therapist or a psychologist, and he tries to have her prescribe some medication to him, because he thinks he's hallucinating, he thinks he's seeing things. And so she does prescribe this stuff, and he's trying to like just rush and not stay there for the whole meeting. So he goes back home. Then he sees this kid again, and he's trying to figure out what he's doing in his house. Why does he keep coming to his house? And he asks him all these questions, and then he realizes that this kid is actually him as a child, as like a 7-year-old boy. It's his 7-year-old self. And Bruce Willis's character, Russ, he sees a lot of things in this kid that he doesn't like. Like, for example, this kid kind of comes across as a loser, just like not a very cool kid. He's just very nerdy. He kind of talks with like a lisp or something like that. He's very sensitive, very emotional. He cries a lot. He's a little overweight. So, and Russ calls him chubby or pudgy on this movie a couple times, and you could see that he doesn't like that the younger version of himself is overweight. So there's a lot of things that he doesn't like about this younger version of himself, and he keeps trying to get him, like he says, all right, I just need to take this medication to make you disappear, because he still thinks he's hallucinating. But then when he takes him somewhere away from his house, and then he sees that his assistant can see him as well, he realizes that he's not hallucinating, that this is actually his younger self. So he just pretends like basically it's his nephew, because he has to take care of him, and he doesn't want to leave him at his house alone by himself and things like that. And as the movie progresses, well, also there's this lady that is kind of she is one of Russ's, I guess, assistants, not like his secretary assistant, but she helps him with his public image work. I think she does like some camera work and things like that. She's maybe like the videographer or photographer, things like that assists with him with his work. And you can tell that there's some chemistry between them, but he basically doesn't try to like pursue any kind of relationship with her or anything like that, but there's definitely some chemistry there. And you'll notice this in a lot of movies. If you look at the protagonist, and not just movies but books, any kind of fictional story, in a lot of them you'll have, if the main character is a guy and then there's a woman that's like maybe his significant other, or the main female protagonist that's by his side throughout a lot of the story, you'll see that often these female characters represent wisdom, and that's not something new. I mean, like you can see in the book of Proverbs in the Bible that wisdom is personified as a woman. And it's just often that way in a lot of like mythological stories, Greek mythology, and like just in a lot of old stories and movies and things like that. You see this often. So I see in this movie that this woman, I can't remember what her name was in the movie, but she is kind of seen as like the voice of wisdom in Russ's life. And when she sees this younger version of himself that he keeps trying to push aside, and he's not treating him very well, he's like telling him he needs to skip a couple meals so he loses some weight. Well, she like says like, you need to be more kind to him, and you know, give him some food, give him what he wants, things like that. And she also tries to get him to not be such a jerk at his job, because he always comes across as a jerk. And then throughout this movie, well, Russ starts to realize he starts to realize that maybe this is happening for a reason. His younger self coming into his life. So he's thinking, okay, well, maybe he's come into my life because I need to help him in a certain way. And in this movie, I think his assistant, the secretary on this movie, tells him, I can't remember if it's her or if it's the camera woman on this movie. Sorry, I don't remember anyone's names on there except for Russ. But one of them tells him, did you ever think that maybe this kid came into your life not just for you to help him? Maybe you are here, maybe he is here for you to help him with some of the issues he's going through, but have you ever thought that maybe it's for you to remember some things? So he's like, okay, well, I didn't realize that until now, but maybe you're right. And then as he's talking to the kid, he realizes that the kid is in school and he's constantly being bullied. And then he was like, oh, this is it. I remember this big fight that happened and I lost. Well, maybe if I can help him to win this fight, then he'll stop being bullied and he'll grow up to be not as much of a loser and stuff like that. And so he helps this kid to learn some fighting techniques. He has a friend that's like a boxer and does some different fighting and stuff. So he takes him to learn underneath him. And then when he takes him to school, he watches as they're having recess. This kid starts to do something mean, and then Rusty, the younger version of Russ, steps in, and then this fight ensues, and well, Rusty winds up winning the fight, essentially. And he gets pulled into the principal's office, and then later his mom is called and asked. She comes in and picks him up, and then Russ, the adult Russ, Bruce Willis, he starts to realize what's going on here. Rusty's mom at this point was like terminally ill, and she wasn't supposed to leave the house by doctor's orders, and so she came to pick up Rusty from school, and she said, oh, please don't get him in trouble, it's his birthday, and he's really a good kid and everything like that. So she takes him home, and then his dad sees him, and he's very upset because she was not supposed to leave the house because of her health, and he's upset at Rusty because she had to leave the house to come and get him, and he kind of yells at him. And also another thing in this movie is that the adult Rusty has this twitch in his eye, and it kind of happens whenever he's stressed out, but he doesn't know where it came from. And then, well, you see in the younger Rusty, whenever his father's yelling at him and berating him, he develops this twitch. So the kid starts twitching after that. And it's a very emotional scene. It's one of those scenes that can make me teary-eyed if I'm if I let it. So anyway, long story short, well, one thing that was very interesting. I'm going to pause right there. So Rusty starts to feel guilty that he asks the adult Russ. He says, "Is my mom gonna die?" And then he says, "Yeah." And then he said, like, "Soon?" And they said, "Yeah." And he's like, "Is it my fault?" And then the adult Rusty tells him, "No, it's not your fault." And he just says, "Don't worry about what your dad said. He's just yelling because he's scared. He reacted that way because he's scared, and because he doesn't know how to raise you by himself." And that was very yeah. It's a very emotional scene. This movie is a very emotional movie, but I think what you realize is that Russ had to learn that what he was trying to do in most of this movie is he was trying to fix the issue with his younger self. He was trying to fix him and, like, make him into this model of a personality that he wanted him to be modeled after. But he realizes that I can't change who this kid is, but this kid has some issues, and he feels guilty about certain things, like his mom dying and things like that. And what he has to learn to do is to love him throughout this, and to to comfort him. And that's one thing that you'll realize when you're doing shadow work, is that there's these things about yourself that you want to change, that you don't want to embrace, but you have to learn to love them, to embrace them, to forgive your past self. Not just forgive them, but sometimes there's actually this practice, and I don't know if it's like, it might be a ancient Hawaiian practice or something, but I think it's called like Ho'oponopono or something like that, and it's where you say these things to yourself in meditation, and it's I think it's like, "I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, and I love you." And that's something that you can do in shadow work if you're, like, meditating, for example. If you're just meditating, like, on your younger self, and some of the traumas and things that you've been to, just learning to love the younger version of yourself and show them, that it's safe. You don't have to be afraid anymore, because we think that we're no longer that person that we were when we were a kid, but our mind doesn't forget these things so easily. It's still stored in our minds. There's still the younger version of ourselves in our minds, and we have to learn to love that aspect of ourselves, and to not try to repress it or try to hide it, and because basically that's that part of our mind that's associated with the inner child in us, is basically, it feels ashamed, and it feels like I can't come out, I can't really express myself. But when we learn to love it and to accept it and to let it be, then that's when true transformation can happen. And I've seen that. I'm not any expert in this field of shadow work or in psychology, but I've seen some of the effects of this transformation, and just the healing, primarily the healing aspect of it. And it is very healing emotionally and mentally. So, yeah, but in this movie, one more interesting thing is that before all of this happened, I forgot to mention it, is that Russ was seeing this, he kept seeing this plane flying around. It was like a red biplane or something like that. But this red plane, like when he was driving to a meeting, to a consultant meeting, and near the beginning of the movie, this plane like flies like 20 feet above his car and like scares him nearly half to death. And he keeps seeing it, so this is a thing that he thinks is a hallucination as well. Well, anyway, after this movie, after the scene with him loving this child and the inner child in himself, and he learns to comfort him and everything like that. Well, they go to this diner. It's their birthday. It's both of their birthdays, so they go to this diner, and then while they're eating their meal, they see this this guy, and he's calling a dog. He calls it Chester. And earlier in the movie, the young Rusty, he kept calling around Russ's house, calling for Chester. And when Russ asked him who's Chester, he was like, "It's the dog that I'm gonna have when I grow up." And then he finds out that Russ doesn't have a dog, and he's like, "What? We don't have a dog?" He's like, "Man, we grew up to be a loser." So, but they see this older man, and he calls this dog named Chester, and then takes him outside. And he's getting into this plane. This guy, he has like a pilot's hat on and everything. And then they call him, and they see that it looks like Bruce Willis, like an older version, like probably 60-year-old version of Russ. And they see that he has a plane now, he has a dog, and then another thing is that they see he has a wife. And the wife appears to be this woman that he's been working with, that has the chemistry with him, but that he hasn't really been, he's been just seeing her as a co-worker and not as a love interest or anything like that. But so long story short, basically, if you haven't figured it out by now, the main character that Bruce Willis plays represents the ego, or the false self. And he has to go and he has to do some shadow work. He has to learn to heal the wounds in of his childhood, go back to his childhood and heal those wounds and love that inner child. And then after this happens, then he sees the future self, his future self, which is more of his authentic self. He is all the things that his childhood wanted, that those true desires that he had of wanting to be a pilot and wanting to have a dog and be married and have a happy family and things like that. Well, now he has all these things, and that is representing the authentic self, or the true self. And that can't happen unless you first do that inner work, the shadow work, and dealing with the side of you that you don't like, that you're trying to repress. So I know I went a little bit long on this video. I hope that you've enjoyed the content. If you do, please make sure to like this video again, and subscribe to the channel if you're not already a subscriber. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope you have a great day. God bless.